The barracks smelled faintly of sweat, oil, and steel, the kind of mixture that clung to every training ground no matter how much soap and water were poured into scrubbing it away. The recruits were gathered in the wide stone-floored hall, their voices buzzing in uneven laughter as a small woman stepped forward to the line of practice targets. She was plain by every measure, her hair tied back without care, her uniform loose and not quite sitting right, her boots scuffed at the tips from too many stumbles. To the young soldiers surrounding her, she seemed like a mistake that had slipped into the program, a civilian that someone had accidentally granted permission to stand alongside warriors. When her name had been called, the laughter had started soft and then rippled louder, as though no one could quite take seriously the idea that this thin figure with hesitant eyes was about to pick up a rifle and demonstrate her aim. The instructors had not stopped them. After all, training was merciless by design, and ridicule was as much a weapon as any bullet. The woman, though, did not shrink back from the smirks and whispers. Her hands shook only once when she lifted the heavy practice rifle, adjusting her grip with awkward slowness, and though her shoulders slumped under the weight, she lifted her chin and faced the target pinned across the stone wall. The laughter swelled louder when her first attempt came with a fumbling movement, the butt of the rifle slipping against her shoulder, the sights nowhere near steady. She fired anyway, and the crack echoed through the hall with a ringing finality that made the crowd burst into harsher laughter. The bolt of light shot across the distance, missing the painted bullseye entirely and slamming into the stone just beside it, scattering dust into the air. She blinked at the mark, lips parted, while the soldiers clapped each other's shoulders and laughed as if the failure were a performance staged for their amusement. She adjusted, tried again, and again the blast went wide, this time higher, striking well above the target. The mocking whistles followed instantly and someone called out, "Try closing your eyes, maybe luck will carry it for you." The woman's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing, simply lined up for another attempt. Even the captain at the far end of the hall, who usually watched these exercises with the cold detachment of a judge, did not intervene to still the mocking voices. His expression, hidden half in the shadow cast by the overhead lamps, remained unreadable as he studied the woman. She was missing badly, that much was obvious, but his eyes were not fixed on her shots alone. They drifted past the obvious, toward where the wall stretched and curved, as though he measured something no one else could see. The woman pulled the trigger again, the shot drifting wide, another failure, and the laughter hit a fever pitch. It was cruel, but it was also routine. Recruits fed on the humiliation of the week because the week rarely lasted more than a week in the program. That was how it had always been, and by tomorrow the plain woman with her awkward stance would likely be gone, dismissed quietly with paperwork stamped in red. Yet as the crowd jeered and the air filled with a din of taunts, the captain's lips moved slightly, forming words too low for any of them to hear. His eyes, sharper than glass, cut from the missed target to the far wall, the one behind the painted boards that no one bothered to notice. Dust trembled faintly on the stone as if stirred by something unseen, though none of the laughing recruits paid attention. The woman, however, hesitated. Her hands trembled, her breath quickened, and her eyes, instead of clinging stubbornly to the bullseye she had failed to strike, shifted toward the far end of the hall. She blinked, as though hearing something the others could not, and raised her weapon not at the painted circle, not at the target mocked by all, but slightly higher, slightly wider, her sights sliding toward the far back wall where the stone curved in a way almost no one bothered to notice. The laughter grew louder, almost choking, as the recruits realized she wasn't even pointing in the right direction anymore. "She's lost it," someone shouted, bent double in delight. "She can't even see the target." More whistles, more jeers, a roar of derision that turned the air thick with ridicule. And then came the voice, low and cutting like a blade, carrying over the noise with a clarity that froze them in place. The captain had spoken, but not in a tone of anger, not in reprimand for the woman's failure. His words were calm, simple, and heavy enough to silence the room like a sudden storm. "Check the back wall," he whispered, and though his voice was soft, it threaded through the laughter like a knife-splitting cloth. At once the noise faltered, smirks stiffened, and heads turned slowly toward where the woman's rifle pointed. For a moment there was only confusion, then unease, and then silence deep enough to hear dust settling on the floor. The recruits stared at the back wall, their eyes narrowing, searching, trying to understand what the captain had meant. The woman's shot fired again, the blast striking not at the target but at a precise seam in the stone far from where anyone had been looking. The impact cracked through the hall, dust and grit spilling down, and the wall shuddered with a groan like something awakening. A jagged line split open where her blast had struck, widening, stretching, and then the back wall itself began to crumble, revealing not solid stone but a hollow cavity hidden behind the training hall. Gasps broke through the silence as chunks of rock fell away, exposing darkness beyond, a chamber that none of them had known existed. The laughter died instantly, replaced by disbelief that tightened into fear as the hollow space gaped wider, and from within that darkness faint glimmers of red light began to pulse. The woman lowered her rifle slowly, her face pale but steady, and for the first time she seemed to know exactly what she had been aiming for. The captain did not move, his expression still unreadable, but his words lingered in the air, commanding, unshakable, "Check the back wall." The room held its breath in the seconds after the wall split open, as if every soldier's lungs had forgotten the rhythm of air. The dust hung in thick clouds, turning the glow of the overhead lights into murky halos, and through that haze the dark hollow stretched wider with each crack and crumble. The recruits who had been laughing moments ago were frozen, some still half smiling in confusion, their mouths open as if waiting for someone else to explain what they were seeing. None of them had ever considered that the fortress they trained in held secrets. To them it had always been stone, iron, and routine, an arena of drills and discipline. Yet now the wall, once dismissed as unremarkable, stood broken to reveal an aperture alive with faint pulsing red veins, like blood flowing through unseen arteries. The plain woman who had missed every shot stood at ease, her rifle lowered but still warm in her grip, and for the first time her small figure seemed less fragile, less misplaced. Her eyes reflected the faint red shimmer from the cavity, and in them there was no confusion, no embarrassment, only a quiet recognition, like someone hearing a melody they had been waiting for. The recruits shuffled uneasily, eyes darting between her and the dark hollow. Fear is contagious and it spread silently among them. The hall that had once echoed with cruel laughter now pressed heavy with dread, the kind that comes when the familiar peels back to show the impossible. One of the younger soldiers, voice trembling, muttered, "What is that?" and the words, though small, cracked the silence wide. More voices rose in nervous fragments. Guesses, denials, curses. None dared approach. The captain, however, moved. His boots struck the stone floor with deliberate weight, and every step seemed louder than the chaos that had filled the room moments ago. He advanced toward the broken wall without haste, his hands clasped loosely behind him, his posture unshaken, as though the sight before them was no surprise at all. He stopped at the jagged opening, the red glow washing faint against his uniform, and turned only slightly to glance back at the recruits. His eyes caught theirs one by one, sharp, commanding, and the noise of their nervous chatter died at once. "Formation," he said simply. His voice did not need to rise, it carried on the gravity of command. The soldiers scrambled instinctively, their training pulling them into order even as unease twitched in their movements. They formed a loose line behind him, rifles raised, breaths uneven, eyes fixed on the red-lit hollow. The woman, still separate, still standing where she had fired her last shot, did not move to join them. She only watched the opening, her lips parting slightly as if words hovered there, unspoken. The captain turned back to the breach, his gaze searching the cavity beyond. At first it was only shadow, pulsing faintly with the glow that came and went like a heartbeat. Then the shape of the chamber emerged, its walls not stone but something smoother, darker, as if carved or grown from another substance entirely. The pulsing veins of light traced patterns across it, converging at points that seemed to hum faintly with hidden power. This was no storage chamber, no forgotten corridor. It was something older, buried deliberately. The captain's jaw tightened. He had suspected something like this. That was why he had not laughed when the woman missed. He had seen the tremors of dust, the subtle sign that the wall was not as it seemed, and he had trusted his instincts. But even he had not expected what now revealed itself. He stepped closer to the hollow, his hand brushing the jagged stone as he leaned slightly in. The recruits behind him tightened their grips on their rifles, their discipline faltering under the strain of the unknown. The silence pressed heavy until one soldier broke it, his fear sharpened into anger. "It's just some trick," he spat. "She can't shoot straight, so now we're standing here staring at walls? This is nonsense." His voice cracked in defiance, but it was thin, desperate. The captain turned his head slowly, his stare pinning the soldier in place like a predator fixing on prey. He did not need to speak, the silence that followed was heavier than rebuke. The soldier dropped his gaze, his bravado dissolving instantly, and the hush returned. Then from the hollow a sound emerged. It was faint at first, like air moving through distant corridors, but then it grew into something sharper, a low mechanical hum that resonated through the stone floor under their boots. The red veins along the chamber walls flared brighter, glowing as though stirred awake, and the air warmed with an unnatural heat. Several soldiers flinched back, raising their rifles, but none fired. The woman took a step forward, her movement small but purposeful, and for the first time the captain's eyes shifted to her. She met his gaze, and though she looked as plain and fragile as she had when the laughter began, there was an unspoken recognition between them, a silent acknowledgement that she knew something the others did not. Without waiting for permission, she walked past the line of recruits. They parted reluctantly, unease and curiosity fighting within them as she moved toward the breach. Her boots crunched on the dust and rubble, each step steady, and when she reached the opening she did not hesitate. She lifted her hand, not to her rifle but to the jagged edge of the wall, and pressed her palm to the smooth black surface within. The moment her skin touched it, the chamber flared alive. The red veins blazed with sudden intensity, flooding the hall with crimson light, and the hum deepened into a resonant thrum that vibrated in their bones. Gasps rippled through the line of recruits, and some stumbled backward in fear, but none dared break formation entirely. The captain did not move, though his eyes narrowed as he watched the woman. Her hand remained pressed to the wall, her body bathed in the crimson glow, and in that light her plainness seemed to fall away. She was no longer awkward, no longer out of place. The glow traced patterns across her skin, markings that had not been visible before, faint lines that shimmered briefly like symbols written beneath the surface of her flesh. The recruits stared, transfixed, as the chamber responded to her touch, the patterns on its walls shifting, rearranging, until a circular shape at the center unfolded like an opening eye. From the darkness within, a gust of hot air surged out, carrying with it the smell of scorched metal and something older, something sharp and metallic that stung their nostrils. The woman withdrew her hand, and the circular opening yawned wider, revealing a stairway descending into shadow. No one spoke. Even the bravest among the recruits dared not voice what they were thinking. That this woman, this plain and fragile figure they had ridiculed, had somehow unlocked something buried beneath their very feet. The captain's expression hardened, his gaze shifting from the stairway to the woman. "You knew," he said, his voice low but carrying weight enough for all to hear. It was not a question. The woman turned her head toward him, and for the first time she spoke. Her voice was soft, steady, and carried the same calm certainty as the captain's own commands. "I didn't know," she said. "I only felt." The word struck through the recruits like a spark in dry kindling. Felt? What did that mean? Was she part of this? Was this some test, some hidden plan they had not been told of? Whispers rippled among them, but the captain raised a hand and the room fell silent again. His eyes lingered on her a moment longer, then turned back to the open stairway. From its depths, the red glow pulsed like a heartbeat, and the hum grew louder, a call to something deeper. The captain drew a slow breath, then spoke, his voice cutting through the thick tension. "Squad, prepare to move. We're going down." The order to prepare for descent hung in the air like a stone thrown into still water, ripples of unease spreading silently across the line of recruits. No one had expected this. Their training had always been drills, sweat, discipline hammered into muscle and bone, but this was different. This was stepping into the unknown, and the unknown has a way of peeling back courage until only fear remains. The stairway yawned below, carved of the same smooth alien substance as the chamber walls, each step gleaming faintly red as though lit from within. The pulse of light seemed to synchronize with their own heartbeats, unsettling in its rhythm, impossible to ignore. The woman remained near the threshold, her rifle hanging slack at her side, her eyes fixed downward as though she heard something none of them could. The captain, however, did not hesitate. He turned to the squad, his presence steady as an anchor in the storm. "Two at the front," he ordered, his voice calm but sharp. "Weapons ready. The rest follow in pairs. Keep formation, and no one fires without command." The recruits, though pale and uneasy, obeyed. Their training had carved reflex into them, and obedience was easier than facing the weight of fear alone. Two stepped forward, rifles raised, eyes flicking nervously to the woman as if wondering whether she would follow. She did not move, not yet, but the captain's gaze lingered on her a moment longer before shifting back to the descent. Without another word, he stepped onto the first stair, and the stone beneath his boot glowed brighter, as if recognizing the weight of a new presence. The two recruits followed, their movements stiff, then the others fell in line, the sound of boots on the strange surface echoing faintly as they began their descent into the red-lit depths. The woman was the last to move. She hesitated only a heartbeat, then lowered her head and followed, her footsteps lighter, quieter, almost as though the stairs welcomed her rather than resisted. The air grew warmer as they descended, thick with the metallic tang that clung to the back of their throats, and the hum grew deeper, vibrating through their chests like the growl of some vast engine hidden in the dark. The stairway spiraled downward, deeper than any of them expected, and though they passed no doors, no windows, no markings, the walls themselves seemed alive, faint pulses of red sliding along the veins in the black surface like blood through arteries. Some recruits muttered prayers under their breath, words swallowed by the oppressive silence, while others kept their eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look too long at the glowing patterns for fear of what they might see within them. At last, the stairway widened into a chamber. It was vast, the ceiling lost in shadow, the floor smooth and dark, stretching in every direction until the red light seemed swallowed by distance. But it was not empty. In the center rose a structure, tall and angular, its surface carved with patterns that seemed to shift when glanced at too long. It pulsed with light at its core, steady, alive, and every hum that had echoed through the stairwell now emanated from it, a deep, resonant throb that rattled their bones. The recruits spread instinctively, weapons raised, forming a perimeter as the captain advanced toward the structure. His steps were deliberate, his posture unflinching, but even he felt the weight pressing down on him here. This was not just a buried chamber. This was something older, something waiting. The woman stepped forward without command, her small frame almost lost in the vastness of the room, but her eyes locked unerringly on the structure as though it called her name. None of the recruits stopped her. They only watched, caught between fear and awe, as she approached the pulsing core. The captain's voice cut the silence. "Identify," he said, his command directed at no one in particular, yet meant to force someone to name the thing before them, to put shape to the shapeless. No one answered. No one dared. The woman, however, lifted her hand again as she had at the wall above, and the air seemed to shiver at her gesture. She did not touch the structure, not yet, but she whispered something, words too faint to catch, and the core of the construct flared in response. The red glow surged brighter, flooding the chamber with light, and the hum deepened into something that was almost a voice, layered tones reverberating like speech too vast to understand. The recruits staggered, some clutching their helmets as the vibrations rang through their skulls, but the woman stood steady, her lips moving, whispering as though answering the call. The captain's eyes narrowed. He had seen strange things in battle, artifacts buried on forgotten worlds, remnants of technologies older than their empire, but never had he seen one respond to a single person as though waiting for them. He raised his hand, signaling the recruits to hold, and for once none questioned him. Their eyes were locked on the woman, their fear tangled with something else now, recognition, perhaps, that the laughter they had wielded against her hours ago had been hollow, blind. She was no mistake. She was the key. The structure shifted. Plates of the black surface slid aside with grinding finality, opening in segments like a flower of stone. Within, shapes stirred, machines perhaps, or something beyond machines, their forms angular and alien, their surfaces veined with the same red glow. They unfolded slowly, deliberately, rising into the chamber like giants shaking off slumber. The recruits gasped, rifles snapping higher, but the captain did not give the order to fire. His instincts told him that to attack would be useless and perhaps suicidal. The woman turned to him then, her eyes wide but not with fear. "They were waiting," she said softly, her voice carrying eerily in the vast chamber. "For us." The words chilled the recruits, but the captain studied her with unwavering eyes. "Not for us," he corrected, his voice low. "For you." The machines, if machines they were, stood fully awake now, towering figures whose limbs hummed with the same energy as the core. Their heads, featureless and smooth, turned in unison toward the woman. No weapons raised, no aggression shown, only recognition. They bowed, a single synchronized motion, low and deliberate, and the sound of it echoed like thunder through the chamber. The recruits recoiled in disbelief, unable to reconcile what they saw with the world they knew. A woman they had mocked, dismissed as useless, now commanded the bow of ancient titans. The captain's eyes flicked to the recruits, noting the terror on their faces, but also the seed of something else, faith or perhaps the beginnings of it. He let the silence linger, the sound of the bow reverberating, before finally speaking again. "Secure the perimeter," he ordered, his voice calm. "No sudden movements. We are not enemies here, unless we choose to be." The recruits obeyed, though their hands trembled, their rifles clutched too tightly. They moved into formation, eyes darting between the machines and the woman who had become the center of this awakening. She stepped closer to the constructs, her expression unreadable, and raised her hand once more. The machines straightened slowly, their towering frames shifting with fluid precision, and one stepped forward, lowering its massive arm. In its palm, a smaller object rested, dark and smooth, veined with faint light. The woman reached for it without hesitation. The captain's hand twitched at his side, instinct screaming to stop her, but he did not. He watched as her fingers closed around the object, and when she lifted it, the chamber blazed with sudden light. The hum rose into a crescendo, no longer a distant vibration but a chorus of sound, a symphony of tones that filled the air until it felt like the very walls trembled with it. The recruits shielded their eyes, some falling to their knees, but the captain stood tall, squinting into the radiance, refusing to yield. The woman turned slowly, the object in her hand glowing brighter, casting her in light so fierce it seemed to burn away every trace of plainness. She no longer looked like the timid, awkward recruit they had mocked. She looked like something more, something born of this place, awakened by its call. Her eyes met the captain's, and for the first time he saw the faintest trace of fear in her gaze, not of the machines, not of the chamber, but of what she was becoming. The glow from the object in the woman's hand slowly dimmed, settling into a steady crimson pulse that matched the rhythm of the chamber itself, as though the two were bound by the same unseen heartbeat. The recruits stared at her, their weapons lowered now not from command but from something deeper, an instinctive recognition that what they faced was beyond the realm of ordinary warfare. No training manual had prepared them for this, no drill had carved into their bones the protocol for when titans bow to a woman they had mocked. Their fear had not left them, it had only shifted, reshaped into awe, suspicion, and unease tangled in equal measure. The captain's gaze never wavered from her. He had fought wars, commanded men, made decisions that shattered lives and forged legends, but never had he encountered something so entirely outside the reach of his control. And yet control was his duty. He stepped closer, boots striking hard against the polished black floor, and the sound carried like a challenge in the vast silence. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low, even but heavy with demand. The woman looked down at the object she held, her fingers curled around its smooth surface. Her lips trembled before she spoke, as though the words themselves resisted being formed. "It's not a weapon," she said finally. Her voice was soft, yet it cut through the silence like a blade. "It's a key." Murmurs broke out among the recruits, fear sharpening into confusion. "A key? To what?" No one dared voice the question aloud, but it burned in their eyes and the captain saw it. He turned to the machines, silent, still watching, and his jaw tightened. They had given it to her, not to him, not to anyone else. That meant she alone could use it, or perhaps she alone had the right to. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The woman looked back to the structure's core, where the pulsing glow seemed to respond to the object in her hand. The hum deepened again, reverberating through the chamber, and the veins of light along the walls flared brighter. The key throbbed in her grasp, and she flinched, her body trembling as though it fed her visions invisible to the rest. Her knees buckled, but she caught herself, lifting her head with sudden urgency. "Something is coming," she whispered, her voice strained, the words breaking as though torn from her. "They buried this, to keep it hidden. Not from us. From them." The chamber seemed to grow colder at her words, despite the heat of the red glow. The recruits shifted uneasily, some gripping their rifles tighter, others glancing toward the stairway they had descended, as though calculating how quickly they could run. The captain did not move. His eyes sharpened, drilling into the woman as if to wrest the truth from her bones. "Who?" he asked. The woman shook her head, clutching the key tighter against her chest. "I don't know. But they're close." The machines stirred at her words. Their heads lifted slightly, their bodies humming louder, and then they shifted formation, turning not toward her, but toward the far end of the chamber, where the walls stretched into darkness. The recruits followed their gaze and froze. From that black distance, faint flickers of light appeared, small at first like sparks, then brighter, sharper, until they resolved into points of cold white. The hum of the chamber rose, vibrating through the air like an alarm, and the machine stepped forward, forming a barrier between the intruding lights and the group. The captain's hand went instinctively to his sidearm, though the gesture was almost laughable against the scale of what approached. The recruits raised their rifles again, though their hands shook, their breaths shallow. They could see it now, movement in the dark, shapes shifting with eerie precision, their outlines sharp and angular, their lights like eyes. The woman staggered, clutching the key tighter, and whispered, "They've found it." The first of the shapes emerged from the dark. It was tall, taller than a man, its body sleek and metallic, its limbs jointed with unnatural sharpness. Its head bore no features save for the twin white lights that glared out like cold stars, and when it moved, it did so with a fluid silence that was more terrifying than any roar. Behind it came more, dozens, their formation flawless, their steps in perfect unison. The recruits stumbled back, fear etched across their faces. Some muttered curses, others prayers, but none fired. The machines that had awakened to the woman's touch stood tall, their red glow burning brighter, and the air crackled with the tension of two ancient forces facing each other once again. The captain's voice snapped through the fear. "Hold position." His tone was sharp, absolute, and the recruits froze, though their eyes screamed for escape. He stepped forward, placing himself between his soldiers and the advancing constructs, his every motion steeped in defiance. He had faced death before, he would not cower now. The woman moved beside him, her face pale but her grip firm on the glowing key. She looked at the white-lit constructs and shuddered, as though some memory not her own passed through her mind. "They won't stop," she whispered. "They came for this. They came for me." Her words hit like a blade in the gut of every recruit, twisting fear into something sharper, more desperate. The captain turned to her, his eyes hard. "Then you'd better learn to use it," he said, nodding to the key. She swallowed, nodding faintly though her hands shook. The red-lit machines took another step forward, their massive frames bracing for conflict, and the chamber pulsed violently, light flaring as though the very walls rebelled against what approached. The white-lit constructs drew nearer, their numbers swelling until the dark was thick with their gleaming eyes. The recruits' rifles trembled in their hands, sweat dripping down their temples, hearts hammering like war drums. Then the clash began. The red-lit titans moved first, their massive limbs swinging with devastating force, slamming into the white-lit intruders. The chamber erupted into chaos, light and sound colliding in a maelstrom of fury. Metal struck metal with thunderous roars, sparks showering across the black floor, the hum rising into a deafening crescendo. The recruits broke formation, some falling back, others firing wildly into the swarm. Their bullets sparked harmlessly against the intruders' armored hides, their futility only deepening their panic. The captain's voice roared through the madness. "Stay together. Watch your flanks." He fired his sidearm into the advancing constructs, each shot precise though ultimately powerless. His command was not to win but to survive. The woman stood at the center of it all, clutching the key as the chamber's light blazed brighter with every strike of the titans. She felt it burning in her hands, surging through her veins, filling her with visions, flashes of battles long past, of these same machines clashing in ancient war, of civilizations reduced to ash in the fire of their struggle. She screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, and raised the key high. The chamber responded instantly. A surge of red light burst from the core, flooding outward in a shockwave that staggered every being in the room. The white-lit constructs faltered, their movements stuttering, their lights flickering as though disrupted. The red-lit titans roared with soundless fury, their power swelling, their strikes growing heavier. The recruits fell to the ground, shielding their eyes from the blast, their ears ringing, their fear momentarily forgotten in the raw awe of the power unleashed. The captain remained on his feet, though barely, his teeth gritted as the shockwave pressed against him. He looked at the woman, her figure framed in blazing crimson light, and for the first time in years, a shiver of something foreign crawled down his spine. Not fear, not awe, something stranger. Hope, perhaps, though tangled in uncertainty. The white-lit constructs staggered, their formation breaking, and the red-lit titans surged forward, striking with renewed fury. The clash grew fiercer, more violent, but the balance had shifted. The key pulsed brighter, its glow bleeding into the woman's skin, her veins alight with the same red fire. She screamed again, not in pain but in release, as the chamber itself seemed to awaken fully, its hum rising into a symphony of war. The recruits could only watch, their laughter from hours ago now a memory that seemed obscene, shameful in the face of what stood before them. The room was now as silent as the grave, the kind of silence that feels heavy, pressing against the skin, dragging one's breath into shallow gulps. No one dared to move, not even the guards whose usual bravado had melted into uncertainty. Elena stood near the center, her hands clasped tightly against her chest as though she could hold her own heart in place and stop it from leaping out. The captain's whisper still echoed in her ears, sharper than any shout. "Check the back wall." Those words had sliced through the laughter, through the mockery, through the arrogance of every person who had doubted her. And now, they were all staring at the shadowed corner of the chamber where the wall met the floor, as though staring alone could force the secret to reveal itself. But no one moved forward. No one except Elena. She had no weapon in her hands, no training in her bones, but something inside her, perhaps that same instinct that had guided her trembling arrow, pulled her feet forward. Step by step, the sound of her shoes against the stone floor seemed louder than thunder in the suffocating stillness. Her breath quivered, but she did not stop. Every pair of eyes followed her, wide and afraid, as if expecting the wall itself to burst open with teeth and claws. When she finally reached the edge, she placed her trembling hand against the rough, cold surface. At first it was only stone. Then she felt it, a faint warmth, pulsing like a heartbeat from within. She gasped, jerking her hand back. "There's something alive here," she whispered, her voice cracking. The captain's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he gave a single nod, as though confirming a theory he had long suspected. "Step aside," he said firmly, his voice low but commanding, and at once his men surged forward, blades drawn, forming a protective circle around Elena. They pressed against the wall, tapping, pressing, listening, searching for what she had felt. The chamber, once a place of mockery and derision, had now transformed into a crucible of fear, and at the center of it all stood the woman they had laughed at only moments before. The first guard to strike the wall recoiled with a hiss, his sword vibrating violently in his hand as though it had struck not stone but something alive and defiant. Sparks burst from the point of impact, scattering across the floor in tiny flashes of red. The captain's expression did not change, but his voice sharpened. Again. Another blow came, harder this time, and the wall shuddered with a strange groan as if it were breathing. The sound was not like rock splitting but like flesh tearing, thick and wet, a sound that made stomachs clench and faces blanch. Someone muttered a prayer under their breath. Another soldier whispered, "This is no wall." And they were right. The surface began to ripple, veins of dark color threading through the stone like roots spreading under skin. Elena stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as realization struck her. The wall was not a barrier at all but a shell, a cocoon hiding something terrible within. The laughter that had once filled this room seemed like the sin of fools now, for none dared even to breathe too loud. Then, with a final groan, the wall cracked, not in shards of stone, but in strands of something sinewy and slick. A gap opened, black and gaping, and from its depth came a faint glow, pulsing rhythmically like the glow of a dying ember. And with that glow came the first sound, a whisper, soft and long, threading through the chamber like smoke. No one could tell if it was words or simply breath, but every hair on every neck stood on end. It was the kind of sound that reached not the ears but the bones, sinking deep into marrow. Elena staggered back further, bumping into the captain's chest, but he stood firm, his eyes locked on the widening crack. He placed one steady hand on her shoulder, not in comfort but in warning, as though to tell her, "Whatever comes next, you will not run. You cannot run." The crack widened, peeling open as the false wall collapsed inward. What lay behind was not a hidden chamber filled with treasure or weapons as some might have hoped, but something infinitely more dreadful, a cavern of flesh and shadow, its surface glistening as though wet, breathing in slow, monstrous rhythm. The pulsing light came from deep within, where something massive shifted, coiling and uncoiling like the body of a serpent in slumber. Gasps broke out. One soldier dropped his sword, the clatter ringing out like a scream. And then came the stench, sickly sweet, thick and cloying like rotting fruit mixed with blood. Several gagged, one retched violently, but no one dared move closer. No one but the captain. He took a single step forward, his voice rising above the suffocating terror, "Stand firm." His command cut through their fear like steel, and though their knees shook, though their throats closed, his men obeyed, reforming the line around him. But their eyes betrayed them. They were staring not at the captain, not at each other, but at the thing within the wall, which now began to stir in earnest. Elena's hands shook as she whispered, "What is it?" Her voice was so low it might have been lost in the cavern's breath, but the captain heard. His jaw flexed. He did not answer immediately, for he knew the truth would break them more than silence. Still, after a long pause, his voice came, cold as a blade, "The thing we were sworn to guard against. The thing that should never have been woken." His words sent a shudder through the crowd, and suddenly their mockery of Elena, their doubts, their arrogance, all of it seemed like ashes swept away by the storm that was about to break. They had laughed at the wrong time in the wrong place. Now, their lives hung on the courage of the woman they had ridiculed and the wisdom of the captain who had seen through her trembling hand. From the depths of the cavern came movement. A claw, or what resembled one, slid forward, dragging across the wet stone, its surface black and gleaming like obsidian. It was impossibly large, each talon the size of a sword. Gasps turned into muffled cries, some soldiers stepping back despite the captain's command. The cavern's pulse quickened, the glow inside flaring brighter with each breath, and then the voice returned, not whispering now but speaking. Words formed, broken and guttural, but unmistakable. "You woke me," the voice groaned, each syllable like the grinding of mountains. Several soldiers broke ranks, stumbling backward in terror. Elena's chest tightened, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. She had never wanted to be here, never wanted to stand in front of such horror, yet here she was, bound by some cruel twist of fate. And in that moment, though her fear was greater than ever before, she realized something. Her arrow had not missed. It had struck true, just not where she had expected. Her trembling hands, her mistake, had been a signal, a key, a summons. The captain's eyes flickered down to her as though he too understood this now. His whisper was meant for her alone, but the entire chamber seemed to lean into it. "You are the one," it answered. The words hit her harder than the sight of the monster itself. She wanted to deny it, to push it away, but the truth was there, undeniable. The wall had pulsed under her touch, alive and waiting. The cavern had awakened at her arrow's cry. She had been chosen, not for her skill, not for her courage, but for something deeper, something she did not yet understand. And as the cavern's monstrous heart began to beat louder, shaking dust from the ceiling and rattling the stones under their feet, she knew this was only the beginning of the nightmare. The silence that followed the captain's whisper had been unlike anything the recruits had ever experienced. Not the silence of discipline, nor the silence of respect. It was something else, something heavier, like the air before a storm. The simple woman, Mara, still stood there in the shooting bay with her hands trembling faintly around the weapon, her earlier missed shot mocking her in the hole riddled target ahead. But it was no longer her failure that the room was staring at, it was the back wall, where shadows danced unnaturally, curling and bending as though something was alive inside the stone itself. The laughter that had once echoed off the walls now died completely, swallowed by a creeping dread that slithered down spines and made the bravest cadets question their senses. Mara herself turned, her breath caught in her chest as she realized the captain had not spoken in jest. Something was there, something none of them should have ignored. And yet, she felt in her gut that her missed shot had not been a failure, but an accidental unlocking of a truth far bigger than all their training drills. The back wall was not just stone, and now everyone could see it. Lines faintly glowed where Mara's shot had ricocheted, sketching out strange runes that pulsed with pale light. The recruits whispered among themselves, their confidence cracking like thin ice beneath too much weight. "What is that?" one stammered, gripping his rifle tighter. It's just some kind of paint trick, right? A prank." But nobody laughed this time. The captain's eyes never left the glowing wall, his voice low, measured as he said, "No prank. No mistake. And if you value your lives, keep your eyes sharp. This room just stopped being a drill hall." Mara, bewildered, tightened her grip on the weapon that felt suddenly too heavy in her hands. She had only come here to prove she could belong among soldiers. She had not expected that her clumsiness might expose something hidden, something none of the polished marksmen around her could have uncovered. It was almost as if the universe had chosen her mistake to open a door. As the wall pulsed again, louder this time, the temperature in the hall shifted sharply. Frost began to creep along the floor tiles nearest to it, cracking faintly like splintering glass. One by one, cadets took involuntary steps backward, their boots squealing against the floor. Mara felt her own instinct screaming to run, but the captain raised his hand in a silent command for stillness. He too looked unsettled, but he carried an aura of steel that steadied the recruits in the face of the unknown. "Weapons ready," he said simply, and the sound of dozens of rifles being raised echoed as a hollow reassurance. Yet, deep down, every man and woman in the hall knew their weapons might not matter against something that twisted reality itself. Mara, caught between her shame and this unfolding terror, lifted her weapon as well, though her hands shook. For the first time, the cadets beside her did not mock her weakness. They did not even look at her. Their gazes were locked on the wall as cracks spidered outward from the glowing runes. Then it happened, the sound that would forever carve itself into their memories. A groaning noise, like the earth itself being torn apart, filled the air as the wall split open down the center. From within, not stone but darkness poured out, thick, rolling, alive. It was as though night itself had been caged inside the barracks, and now it was free. The recruits panicked, shouts filling the air, but the captain barked one single word, "Steady." And against all odds, it cut through their terror like a blade. Mara could hardly breathe as she watched the shadows coil into shapes, arms, claws, faces without eyes, and yet, as horrifying as it was, she could not shake the feeling that this was somehow connected to her shot, to the strange inevitability that had led her here. Perhaps her presence, dismissed as meaningless, was the key all along. She whispered without realizing, "I didn't miss. I hit where I was supposed to." The captain heard her, his sharp eyes darting to her with something like recognition, though he said nothing. The creatures that emerged from the wall gave them no time for comfort. The first shadow lunged with speed that blurred, its claw tearing through the space where one cadet had been standing an instant earlier. That cadet screamed, firing wildly into the black form, but the bullets vanished like pebbles into water. The room erupted into chaos. Gunfire roared, muzzle flashes lit the gloom, and soldiers screamed orders over the cacophony. Mara found herself moving on instinct, raising her rifle, firing, not at the creatures, but back at the runes glowing faintly around the opening. To her shock, every bullet that struck them flared brighter, like a barrier struggling to form. She had no idea why she did it, but it felt right. "Aim for the runes," she cried, her voice breaking, cutting through the storm of fear. No one listened at first, not until the captain repeated her words with iron authority. "The back wall, support her." Suddenly the firing turned, bullets slamming into the patterns that Mara's shot had awakened. The runes blazed, and the shadows shrieked as if in agony, recoiling. The room, once a death trap, now flickered with hope. Mara's mistake had become their salvation. The battle stretched on like a nightmare without end. For every shadow forced back, another pushed forward, faster, hungrier, their wails drilling into the minds of the recruits until some broke, throwing down their weapons in panic. But others stood firm, especially those nearest Mara, who found themselves rallying around her almost without realizing. Her body moved with